A humble single mom comforts a crying boy, unaware his millionaire dad is watching. Warm welcome to Beyond Color Stories. I'm your storyteller, James, and I'm truly honored to have you here with me today. I hope you're doing well, staying safe, and keeping your heart open. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know where my beautiful listeners are tuning in from. Before we begin, if you haven't already, I kindly invite you to join James's family. Just hit that subscribe button and become part of this growing circle of heart, healing, and unforgettable stories. Don't miss today's story. I promise you, it will touch your soul, it will move your spirit, and maybe, just maybe, it will help you believe in love, strength, and second chances all over again. From my heart to yours, I pray peace finds your home, joy finds your soul, and love wraps around you in every hidden corner of your life. Now, let's dive into the story. The sun hung lazily in the soft blue sky, its rays casting a gentle golden glow across the neighborhood park, where birds chirped quietly and leaves rustled with the mild afternoon breeze, painting the scene with serenity and slow-moving peace. And there, on an old wooden bench under a flowering tree whose petals occasionally floated to the earth like soft snow, sat Rena, a woman of rare grace and depth, her brown, smooth skin radiant in the natural light, her long, delicate fingers cradling her baby girl with motherly tenderness. The child nestled in the warmth of her mother's arms, tiny breaths rising and falling against her chest, swaddled securely in a faded pink blanket that still carried the fresh scent of lavender and love. And Rena, dressed in a simple cream-colored blouse and soft blue jeans, exuded an unshakable calm, the kind of quiet strength only hardship and motherhood could forge, as she hummed softly, a tune that was neither happy nor sad, but held the soul of someone who had known both joy and pain, her eyes scanning the open playground where children ran with squeals of laughter, echoing against the metal slides and swing chains clinking in rhythm with their joy. And though Rena remained still, her eyes missed nothing, for even in her own gentle moment, she remained a protector, always alert, always present, and it was in that watchful silence that she noticed him. A little boy, no more than 6 years old, sitting at the edge of the swing set, his small frame curled into itself like a leaf against the wind, his hands trembling as they rubbed at his wet, reddened eyes, his knees scraped and dusty, shoes untied, his breath shallow and panicked as though the world had suddenly become too large, too loud, and far too lonely. And Rena's heart, already stretched thin by the burdens of being a single mother, skipped with instant worry, because pain in any child's eyes was enough to move her. But this boy, he looked lost in every possible way, and without thinking, without pausing, she gently shifted her baby girl to her other arm, stood up slowly, walked with steady feet across the bark-covered playground, and knelt before him, her knees pressing into the dirt, not caring for the stains or the curious glances of strangers nearby, because nothing in that moment mattered more than this small, trembling soul. And she spoke softly, not asking questions yet, not startling him with concern or adult anxiety, but instead letting her voice become a blanket of calm. "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you okay?" she said, her tone warm and feather-light, her fingers reaching forward but not yet touching, giving him space to choose her. And he looked up, his lashes heavy with tears, his bottom lip quivering as if any more words would break him. And in that one glance something ancient stirred in Rena, the ache of abandoned moments, the sorrow of being lost and unseen. And before she could say another word, the boy, with a sudden burst of trust, born from desperation, lunged into her arms, burying his face against her shoulder, sobbing with the kind of cry that reached deep into the chest, a cry of fear, of confusion, of overwhelming aloneness. And Rena wrapped him close, her baby girl between them, pressed gently to the side, and she held the boy with the same instinctive love she had reserved only for her child, rocking him back and forth, as if she'd always known him, whispering, "It's okay, you're safe, I've got you," over and over, her fingers stroking the back of his head, soothing, calming, giving her warmth like it was the most natural thing in the world. And she didn't know his name, didn't know who he belonged to, but none of that mattered, as his sobs slowed into sniffles, his breaths lengthened, and the tight ball of fear he had been began to unwind slowly in the circle of her arms. And just a few feet away, standing beneath a tall tree with dark glasses hiding stormy eyes, stood Mr. Deacock, his tailored navy suit untouched by the dust of the park, his Italian leather shoes planted on the trimmed grass like they didn't belong in the same world as the dirt path his son had cried upon. But for the first time in years, he didn't care about appearances, didn't think about business deals or investment returns, because his gaze was fixed, unmoving, consumed entirely by the sight of his only son, Alex, finding comfort in the arms of a stranger, and not just any stranger, but a woman who looked nothing like the socialites and models he'd been surrounded by. A woman whose clothes were worn but clean, whose posture radiated dignity without pride, whose skin glowed not with wealth but with warmth. And it shook him to see this moment. It shook him in a place he had long forgotten could feel, because since the death of his wife, since the final scream in the hospital room where she'd bled out bringing Alex into the world, Mr. Deacock had sworn never to open that tender part of himself again, the part that hoped, that loved, that let down walls. But here it was crumbling, brick by brick, just watching this woman hold his son as if she had known him since birth, as if she knew what Alex needed better than he ever had, and guilt laced through him, because how many times had Alex reached for him with teary eyes, and he'd been too busy or too broken to notice. And now, seeing his son melt into her embrace, feeling safe for the first time in what seemed like forever, Mr. Deacock was frozen in place, too stunned to interrupt, too haunted to speak, too captivated to walk away, and Rena, still unaware of the man whose life she had just stepped into, adjusted her grip on both children, her arms aching but strong, rocking gently as she hummed a lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her when nights were too long and hope was too thin. And Alex, sweet Alex, nestled into her as if her heartbeat were the very sound his soul had been longing for, and the baby girl reached out a chubby hand toward him, cooing, her little fingers brushing his cheek as if blessing him. And Rena laughed softly, a sound that floated up like music through the air. And it was then, right in that moment, that Mr. Deacock felt something deep within him shift, something he couldn't name yet, only feel, a pull toward this scene, toward this woman, toward a future that had not yet begun but already felt real in the most impossible way. And still Rena didn't look up, didn't know the eyes on her, didn't sense the storm of emotions she was stirring in a man used to controlling everything except his own broken heart. And she whispered again to Alex, "You're safe now, baby," and kissed the top of his tousled hair, her tears silent, unseen, because she knew what it was to be lost and needed someone to find you, and she would hold him for as long as he needed, unaware that this single act of love was about to change the course of her life forever. As the final notes of Rena's soft humming faded into the breeze, and Alex's breath slowed against her shoulder, the quiet rustle of polished shoes stepped forward from beneath the old oak tree where Mr. Deacock had stood rooted for far too long, heart heavy with unfamiliar emotion, and only then did Rena finally look up, blinking as her eyes met those of a tall, sharply dressed man approaching with careful steps, his expression unreadable beneath perfectly styled hair and the hard lines of a well-chiseled face that had grown too used to showing power instead of emotion. And though she had no idea who he was, just another father in the park, she assumed, she instinctively rose to her feet with the baby cradled on her hip and Alex still half clinging to her side, his small fingers gripping her skirt as if afraid she'd vanish. But when the man extended his hand toward his son, speaking his name with a subtle softness that betrayed his tension, the boy finally released his hold on Rena and walked to him, hesitating for a beat before allowing himself to be scooped up into his father's arms. And Rena offered a gentle smile, one born not from pride, but from the quiet grace she carried into every moment, unaware that her warmth had just left an imprint on a soul long numbed by grief. And Mr. Deacock, holding his son with a firm arm, met her eyes briefly and said, "Thank you for being kind," his voice carefully restrained, polished like everything else about him. But his words fell too heavy for the air to ignore, and she nodded modestly, brushing a curl from her cheek, as her daughter babbled softly in her arms. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away toward the bench where her handbag rested, her steps unhurried, unaware that the very act of walking away made him watch her even longer, his mind warring with questions he didn't dare voice. And later that night, long after the city skyline flickered in amber light outside the windows of his high-rise office, Mr. Deacock sat at his desk, staring at nothing, his laptop open to a blank document, his pen motionless over a page he hadn't touched, because his mind was still at the park, playing the moment again and again like a loop that refused to end. The way her voice calmed Alex, the ease in which she held both children, like love was a second language, the glow of her skin under the soft light, and the way her presence pulled warmth from a place inside him he thought had died the night his wife did, and he didn't understand it. Not fully, didn't want to admit that a stranger in modest clothes with a baby on her hip had shaken him more than any boardroom decision or market crash ever had. But the next day, with a quiet urgency he told no one about, he found himself at that same park again, a paper cup of coffee in hand, dressed in business casual for once instead of a three-piece suit, standing near the tree he had claimed as a silent post, hoping, though he wouldn't call it that, to see her again. And when he did, when he spotted her sitting cross-legged in the grass beneath the sun, her baby girl kicking chubby legs on a small blanket beside her while Rena laughed at something unseen, his breath caught unexpectedly, not because she was flashy or posed, but because her joy was unfiltered, natural, like the breeze or the shifting clouds. And though he didn't move closer, didn't speak or draw attention to himself, he watched the way one watches art that speaks directly to the soul. And as Alex spotted her from the sandbox and toddled over on his tiny legs, she welcomed him with that same open heart, clapping gently and letting him plop beside her without hesitation, sharing the soft toy in her hand between the two children. And Mr. Deacock didn't stop him, couldn't really, because for the first time in months his son was laughing, and he knew it had nothing to do with money or gifts or expensive therapists, but with this woman who simply understood what love looked like when it had no conditions. And the next day and the day after that, he returned again, each time standing at a distance, silent, unseen, letting the world around him fade into blurred noise while his focus remained only on her, and he memorized her movements. The way she tucked her baby's blanket tighter when wind blew too strong, how she helped Alex wipe sand from his eyes with her sleeve, and not an ounce of disgust, and how she giggled when the little boy threw a leaf in the air and called it magic, her voice like honey over the rustle of the trees. And what haunted him most was not her beauty, though it was quiet and undeniable, but the calmness in her spirit, the gentleness in how she existed, as if she had made peace with battles he couldn't even begin to imagine. And every time she laughed or lifted her daughter to the sky with whispered dreams, he felt a pang in his chest that was neither pain nor pleasure, just raw, slow, unraveling emotion. And he began to notice how he planned meetings around those park hours, just so he could have a few minutes watching her presence from the shadows. And he hated himself for not speaking, for not thanking her properly. but he couldn't bring himself to disturb the quiet world she created, a world his son seemed to bloom within. And even when she wasn't looking, even when she bent to tie Alex's shoe or read aloud from a tattered children's book that made the boy lean in, wide-eyed, Mr. Deacock felt like an intruder, not on her privacy but on her peace, because she was untouched by the noise of his life and the idea of being seen by her, not as a billionaire, not as a man with scars and status, but simply as a father, maybe even as a man, was terrifying. And yet, every time she wiped Alex's nose with care or smoothed the hair from his forehead as if he were hers, Mr. Deacock stood frozen in place, watching the quiet miracle of his son finally smiling without effort, finally being held in a way he hadn't known since his mother's passing. And it tore something open in him, a yearning that went beyond attraction, something that felt dangerously close to longing, for comfort, for family, for a woman who didn't even know the storm she had walked into. And still, Rena had no idea who he truly was, had never asked his name or tried to impress him, had never acted like she deserved anything in return, and that, more than anything, made him want to walk up to her, to speak, to introduce himself not as Mr. Deacock, CEO of 3 corporations, but just as the father of the boy she held that day with such kindness. But each time he stepped forward, the weight of his own emotional armor kept his feet planted, afraid of what she'd see if she looked too closely, if she saw the pain behind his tailored suits, the regrets behind his success. And so he remained in the shadows, watching, remembering, hoping, quietly undone by the presence of a woman who changed everything without even knowing she had. The air carried a mellow warmth that afternoon, with a faint breeze teasing the branches above, casting playful shadows across the park grass where Rena sat cross-legged on a checkered blanket, her baby girl beside her, gurgling happily at the drifting clouds. And for the first time that week, Rena had allowed herself to rest, to sink into the moment without worrying about bills, about the quiet ache of loneliness, or the exhaustion woven into her bones from nights spent rocking a child in one arm while holding back tears with the other. And as she adjusted her baby's bonnet, smoothing it gently over her daughter's soft curls, she noticed Alex a few feet away, crouched in curiosity, eyeing the baby with a look of wonder, and her daughter, in return, kicked her legs with joy and let out a bright giggle that filled the air like sunshine, her tiny hands stretching outward toward the boy. And in that simple gesture, something magical unfolded, a connection between 2 children too young to know the meaning of loneliness, but instinctively drawn to joy. And Alex responded with a sudden peal of laughter, unrestrained, pure, the kind of laughter Rena hadn't heard in days and didn't realize she missed until it arrived. And he toddled closer, dropping to his knees and gently tapping the baby's hand, causing her to squeal with delight. And before long, the two were rolling together on the grass, the baby's soft squeals blending with Alex's amused giggles, their innocent joy echoing through the park, louder than the rustling leaves or distant conversations. And Rena sat in stillness, watching them, a gentle smile curling on her lips as she leaned on one hand and let her heart drink in the scene. For this pure, unfiltered happiness felt like a balm she hadn't known she needed, and just beyond the reach of their shared laughter, standing partly obscured by the tall flowering hedges, Mr. Deacock observed silently, arms crossed, sunglasses shielding his eyes, but doing nothing to mask the way his lips had curved into the faintest, most reluctant smile, a smile that felt foreign on his face, yet so instinctively right in that moment that he didn't resist it. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel like an outsider in his son's life, didn't feel like a man watching from behind the glass, because there was something about seeing Alex laugh like that, freely, deeply, beside that baby girl and under the watchful care of Rena, that made his chest swell with emotion too tangled to name, and his gaze didn't just rest on the children, but often wandered back to Rena, to the softness in her posture, the way her eyes lit up when her daughter clapped with joy, and the way her head tilted slightly every time she laughed. Not for show, but because her spirit lived in moments like this, and it was then that he realized he wanted to preserve that laughter, not just for his son, but for her, for the woman who had unknowingly become the center of these quiet afternoons. And so the next day, when she returned to her small apartment on the second floor of an aging brick building with peeling paint and flower pots lining the edge of her balcony, she found a neatly tied paper bag resting at her door. Inside, fresh groceries, baby formula, organic fruits, and soft diapers folded precisely, with no note, just quiet thoughtfulness. And Rena paused, one hand holding her baby close and the other hovering over the gift, her eyes scanning the empty hallway for a face she wouldn't find, unsure whether to be wary or grateful, though her tired heart leaned toward the latter, and as the days passed, more things arrived. A warm baby blanket stitched in pastel hues with the initials R and A tucked in the corner, new shoes placed outside for Alex, shoes that fit perfectly the next time he ran to her in the park, and though Rena never saw who left them, the offerings began to feel like soft whispers of care from someone who saw her struggle and wanted, in some invisible way, to honor her for it. And each time she opened her door to another surprise, her heart thudded a little faster, her lips parting in surprise, because while she had known kindness in passing, she had never known it to linger like this, never known it to follow her home like a quiet shadow of support. And on one evening, while rocking her baby by the window as the sky dimmed into rose and lilac hues, she found herself whispering aloud, "Who are you?" Not expecting an answer, but longing to know, because part of her, though she wouldn't admit it, had begun to hope it was the father of the boy, the man with the unreadable gaze and the quiet presence, the one who had said thank you that day, and then never returned with words, only with gifts that warmed her hands and heart. And meanwhile, Mr. Deacock stood outside her apartment. At a distance he felt guilty for breaching, standing in the shadows across the narrow street, watching the light in her window flicker, unsure why he couldn't just knock, why he couldn't just speak, but terrified that if he stepped forward, he might shatter the delicate, beautiful mystery she had become in his mind. Because what if she looked at him and saw only the man who had failed his son, the man who had built a kingdom of money but couldn't build a home filled with joy? And so he stayed back, content for now to watch her silhouette in the light, the curve of her shoulder as she leaned over her baby, the sway of her body as she sang songs too soft to hear. And every night he left something behind, not just objects, but pieces of his guarded heart, hoping that even in silence he was telling her she mattered, that her gentleness had changed something in him, something he thought was buried beneath layers of coldness and grief. And as the days bled into one another and summer bloomed brighter, the park became their quiet universe, where children played and laughter painted the air, where Rena's presence was steady as the sun, and where Mr. Deacock, the powerful man once untouched by emotion, found himself walking slower, standing longer, and, against all odds, smiling more often. And that smile, however rare, however slight, began to live not just on his lips, but in his soul. A quiet confession he wasn't yet brave enough to voice, but one that echoed every time she reached out to lift his son without hesitation, and every time she looked at the world like it hadn't broken her, even though it tried, and perhaps, in the silent way of people meant to find each other, she was already healing him from a distance he didn't yet dare to close. The days that followed passed in soft rhythm, and though no words had yet been exchanged beyond the brief thank yous and kind glances, something invisible yet unshakable had begun forming between them, like an unspoken thread stretched gently across the space they shared but never acknowledged. And then, one afternoon, as clouds rolled in and the sky darkened suddenly above the familiar park, Rena found herself once again seated on her usual blanket, her baby girl babbling happily in her arms, while Alex built little castles from grass and mud nearby, his laughter bright even as the breeze shifted coldly, and Rena tilted her head toward the sky, sensing rain long before the first drop fell. And then, with almost no warning, the clouds burst open and heavy droplets cascaded from the heavens in thick, wild sheets, soaking the park in moments. And without hesitation, Rena scrambled to gather the children, her shawl already in her hands as she pulled Alex close to her side with practiced care, cradling her baby against her chest while sheltering them both beneath the thin fabric, the rain soaking her back but her arms locked tight around the children, her laugh rising through the storm as Alex squealed in surprise and clung to her skirt, his small hands wrapping around her waist as she knelt lower to give them better cover. And though the rain was fierce, her laughter didn't stop. It rose like a bell through the roar, full of light, full of life. And it was that sound that reached Mr. Deacock before his eyes did, that joyful sound cutting through the drumming storm, and his heart lurched the moment he saw her, bent low over the two children, shielding them with nothing more than her own soaked shawl and unwavering love, and without thinking, without planning or calculating, he flung his car door open and ran across the pavement, the rain hitting his shoulders like stones, but his stride unshaken, his hand gripping the large black umbrella that had waited unused in his passenger seat for weeks. And when he reached her, when he extended the umbrella above their heads, covering the three of them with its wide, sheltering arc, Rena looked up, and for the first time their eyes truly met, not in passing, not in shadow or distance, but fully, completely, the storm quieting for a moment around them as their gazes held each other, and Rena, startled but not afraid, blinked against the rain on her lashes and met his stare with calm kindness, her arms still curled protectively around both children, and he, standing above her with water dripping from his hair and his coat clinging to his frame, simply said, "You're soaked," his voice quieter than the storm, but somehow louder in her ears, and she smiled, a small, tired, grateful smile, and replied, "So are you." And though they were only words, something else passed between them in that moment, something that didn't need to be named, and without asking, he crouched beside her, holding the umbrella lower so the children wouldn't be chilled, and Rena adjusted her baby against her shoulder while gently pulling Alex into the fold of her shawl again, and the boy looked up at his father, eyes wide but not frightened, and then leaned back into Rena's side with the kind of trust that said he didn't see the separation adults saw. He just knew who made him feel safe, and that silent acceptance tightened something in Mr. Deacock's chest that he hadn't prepared for, and they remained like that for several moments, all four huddled beneath one too small umbrella, the world around them dripping and wild while the space beneath the umbrella felt strangely warm, almost suspended from time, and when the rain finally softened to a steady drizzle, Rena began gathering their things, folding the damp blanket into her bag, holding her baby close, and gently urging Alex to his feet. And Mr. Deacock didn't offer to carry anything. He simply walked beside them, the umbrella still overhead, his coat now completely soaked through, but his hands steady, his eyes forward, and they walked without speaking, the air between them dense with everything they didn't know how to say. And when they reached the bus stop, a small shelter with chipped paint and a sagging bench, Rena set the baby down on her lap and patted the space beside her for Alex, who sat down immediately and leaned against her, and she looked up at Mr. Deacock, her hair clinging to her forehead in damp curls, her shawl soaked through, and said softly, "Thank you." And this time it was more than politeness. It was layered with meaning, gratitude, wonder, and the realization that she no longer saw him as just the father of the boy she often comforted. And Mr. Deacock, still standing as the rain fell softly around him, gave her a nod that was almost a bow, his voice low as he replied, "No, thank you for always being here." And they stared at each other again, and this time when their eyes locked, it wasn't fleeting. It lingered, it paused, and when their fingers brushed as she handed him the baby's dropped rattle, both felt a spark they pretended not to notice, though it buzzed like electricity beneath the skin. And just as the bus rounded the corner and its headlights illuminated the drizzle, Rena rose, adjusting her baby's hat and helping Alex climb the steps first, and before she followed him up, she turned to Mr. Deacock once more, and this time she didn't smile out of habit, but out of feeling, confused, warm, vulnerable, and he saw it, felt it, mirrored it, his hand half lifted as if wanting to reach out but stopping short, and as the door hissed closed between them and the bus began to pull away, he stood there on the sidewalk, rain settling into the collar of his shirt, watching until the red tail lights disappeared, and in that stillness, in that exact moment of departure, a truth anchored itself deep in his chest. He didn't want her to remain a stranger anymore. The rain had stopped hours ago, but its memory lingered in the mist that clung to the evening air as Mr. Deacock stood alone on the sidewalk, his gaze still fixed on the path where the bus had disappeared. And though the street had grown quiet and the city lights had begun their nightly glow, he remained rooted there, his heart caught between the silence Rena left behind and the words he hadn't dared to say. And that night, long after the drizzle had dried from his clothes and he'd changed into something more comfortable, he sat in his living room with the lights dimmed and a glass of untouched wine in his hand, watching Alex fall asleep on the couch, his son clutching a stuffed bear and murmuring something about the baby's giggle. And it struck him suddenly how often that woman filled their thoughts, how naturally her presence had begun stitching itself into the quiet spaces of their lives. And so, with the weight of uncertainty thick in his chest, he reached for his phone, fingers hesitating above the keys before finally typing a message, simple and straightforward. "Dinner tomorrow? Alex misses you. Bring the baby too, if you like." And he stared at it for a long time before pressing send, afraid of what her silence might mean, and yet hoping deeply that she would come. And the next day, Rena saw the message while folding baby clothes on her bed, her daughter gurgling beside her. And for a long moment she didn't move, her breath held between yes and no, because part of her feared what dinner might mean, feared stepping into a world she had no place in. But there was something in those few words that reached her, something raw and almost tender. And so she replied, "What time?" And the moment he saw her response, Mr. Deacock let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And the hours that followed were filled with more preparation than he admitted to his staff, though he pretended it was all for Alex, telling the chef to keep the food simple and the lights warm, instructing the housekeeper to make the space feel less like a mansion and more like a home. And when the doorbell finally rang that evening, his heart beat a little faster, and he smoothed his shirt, not knowing why he suddenly cared how he looked. And when he opened the door, there she was, Rena, standing in the soft glow of the porch light, her baby in one arm, and Alex already bounding toward her with a joyful shout. And she wore a long, modest dress of soft peach fabric, her hair pinned neatly, her expression cautious but calm, and he greeted her with a quiet, "You came?" And she nodded, shifting the baby on her hip and offering a small smile that didn't reach her eyes yet, and the moment they stepped inside, warmth welcomed her. Not just the warmth of the house with its golden lights and rich wooden floors, but the kind that came from small, thoughtful touches. A baby seat waiting beside the dining table, a basket of toys near the couch, a pitcher of lemonade on the counter, and she noticed all of it as she removed her coat, heart fluttering with nerves. And Mr. Deacock led them to the dining room where a simple meal was set, spaghetti with garlic bread and a bowl of salad, nothing extravagant but everything inviting. And as they sat down, Alex insisting on sitting between them, Rena helped her baby settle in a borrowed high chair, surprised to find it fit just right, and conversation was slow at first, polite and cautious. But when Alex began talking about their park days and imitating the baby's giggles, Everyone laughed, even Mr. Deacock, whose laughter was quieter, as if he had forgotten the sound of it and was now trying to remember, and Rena, spooning soft food into her daughter's mouth, looked up and caught that smile, the kind that reached his eyes for the first time. And something inside her shifted, not dramatically, but like a door creaking open a little more, and over the next hour stories slowly spilled across the table like a shared meal. Rena telling little pieces of her life, not in detail, not in bitterness, but in quiet truths about working nights, about learning how to swaddle a newborn on her own, about making peace with being abandoned and finding purpose in love instead of resentment. And Mr. Deacock listened, truly listened, his chin resting in his hand, his expression soft. And when she paused, unsure if she had said too much, he offered a piece of his own truth, not about business or wealth, but about the silence of a home too big after his wife died, the way guilt gnawed at him when he couldn't reach his son emotionally, and how he had once believed some parts of the heart could never be mended. And Rena met his eyes across the flickering candlelight, the baby now sleeping on her chest, and something unspoken but unmistakable passed between them, a moment of recognition, of mirrored pain, of mutual understanding that didn't need words to be real. And when dessert came, small bowls of fruit and vanilla ice cream, it felt less like a formality and more like comfort, like the sweetness they hadn't known they needed. And Alex curled against Rena, full and content, and Mr. Deacock sat back in his chair, watching them with a softness he hadn't let himself feel in years. And he realized then it wasn't just gratitude that drew him to this woman. It was the peace she brought, the gentleness she carried like light, even in exhaustion. And as she rose to leave, adjusting the baby once more and accepting his offer to drive her home, he walked them to the car slowly, his steps reluctant. And when they reached her doorstep and she turned to thank him again, this time her voice trembled slightly, not from fear but from the emotion she couldn't name, and he looked at her, really looked at her, and simply said, "You made this house feel alive tonight." And Rena, startled, smiled fully, genuinely, and replied, "It's the children." But both of them knew it wasn't just the children. It was the way they looked at each other now, not like strangers, not like shadows crossing paths, but like two souls who had stepped into each other's silence and found warmth there. And as he drove away, watching her silhouette disappear behind the curtain, Mr. Deacock felt something bloom quietly inside him, something fragile, unexpected, but real. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something neither of them had believed they deserved. When Rena closed the door behind her after that quiet, stirring dinner at Mr. Deacock's house, she leaned her back gently against the wood, her baby sleeping soundly in the sling wrapped across her chest, and the stillness of her small apartment felt strangely louder than it had before, not empty exactly, but heavier with something unnamed. A lingering warmth that hadn't faded with the closing of the door, something that had followed her all the way home from the way his eyes lingered on her at the porch, the way his voice softened with sincerity when he said she had made his house feel alive, and though she had heard compliments before, that one settled into her chest in a way no other ever had, like he wasn't speaking about the food or the laughter or the children, but about her presence, about her soul, about something deeper she hadn't known was visible to someone else anymore. And that night, after she had laid her baby girl gently in the small bassinet beside her bed, after she had tucked the little knit blanket around her tiny toes, she sat at the edge of the mattress and stared at the floor for a long time, her fingers threading through the hem of her dress, remembering the way his home didn't feel like a mansion when they were all together. It felt like a place where things could heal. Over the next few weeks, that night became less of a memory and more of a turning point, though neither of them named it or tried to define it. But it showed in the small changes, how Mr. Deacock began appearing more often, no longer from a distance or hidden behind sunglasses at the edge of the park, but beside her, sitting quietly on the bench as their children played, handing her a cup of warm tea without asking how she liked it, because somehow he knew, asking softly if she had eaten, listening without ever offering pity when she said no. Their conversations grew not only longer but deeper, sinking into stories that felt more like confessions, gentle moments when the space between them shrank not with touch, but with truth, like when he told her about the way Alex used to cry in his sleep for reasons he couldn't explain, or when she told him how she used to hum lullabies in the dark to calm her own fear more than her baby's. They began to understand each other in a language beyond words, where the silences were not voids but comfort, where a glance could say more than paragraphs. Then, one golden evening, when the sun had dipped just low enough to scatter soft amber light across the horizon and paint the sky with streaks of lavender, Rena sat on her small wooden porch swing, her baby curled asleep beside her with her cheeks rosy from the warmth of the day, and the air was thick with the scent of summer grass and quiet wind when Mr. Deacock arrived, not dressed in his usual sharp suits or guarded expressions, but in a soft gray sweater and calm eyes. And when he asked if he could sit beside her, she didn't hesitate. She moved the blanket gently and gestured to the empty space next to her. The swing creaked slightly beneath their weight as he settled in, his hands folded, and for a while they didn't speak. There was no rush, no urgency, just the mutual awareness that the quiet between them was sacred, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have earned it, who trust it. Rena's gaze was fixed on the tree across the street, but her thoughts were inside her chest, swirling, and finally, in a voice that trembled only slightly, she said, "There's a part of my story I haven't told you," and her fingers tightened slightly around the swing's edge as she took a deep breath and added, "My husband. He left when I told him I was pregnant. I thought he'd be scared, maybe overwhelmed, but I never thought he'd look me in the eye and say he didn't want this life, that he didn't want us. He packed in a single day. No goodbye, no sorry, just gone." Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes grew glassy, and she didn't stop there. She told him about the first night she spent alone in their shared bed, how the pillows still smelled like him, how her fingers clutched her belly, wondering if her baby could feel the fear pounding in her chest, how she worked as a cashier during the day and cleaned motel rooms at night, how she once skipped meals for 3 days just to afford a second-hand crib, how she sang songs into the darkness, not because her baby cried, but because she needed to believe she still had a voice. And when she finished, when her shoulders had sagged just slightly from the weight of what she had released, she looked over at him expecting silence, maybe pity. But what she found instead was a man whose jaw was clenched, whose eyes shimmered not with sympathy, but with reflection. And he said, "My wife died in childbirth," the words leaving his lips like stones carried for too long, heavy and flat. One moment she was laughing, telling me to stop pacing because I was making the nurse nervous, and the next, monitors screaming, doctors pushing me out of the room, and then just silence. I never got to hold her hand at the end, never got to say goodbye. And then they handed me Alex, and I looked down at this tiny, innocent face, and all I could think was, he's alive because she's not. His voice cracked just barely, and he swallowed, eyes distant. I didn't know how to be a father. I had nannies, tutors, but none of them could stop him from crying in his crib at night. None of them could give him what he needed. I didn't know what that was, and I hated myself for that. Rena listened not with sadness, but with understanding so deep it made her eyes burn, and without asking permission, she reached across the space between them and laid her hand on top of his, not gripping, just resting, a bridge instead of a question, and he didn't pull away. In fact, his hand turned gently beneath hers, palm meeting palm, fingers intertwining softly like something sacred was forming in the space between flesh and bone. The porch swing creaked again as a soft breeze passed them, but they didn't speak for several minutes. Didn't need to, because everything they had shared, everything they had exposed, lived in the silence between their joined hands. Then he turned his head slightly, looked at her not as a man confused by emotion, but as one overwhelmed by the unexpected grace of it, and he whispered, "I never thought someone like you could exist." His voice so low it almost didn't reach her ears, and yet it echoed inside her like thunder in a canyon. Her lips parted as if to reply, but no words came. Only a warmth in her chest that flooded her eyes and made her lean in just a little closer. Not enough to blur the lines, but enough to let him know she felt the same. Because she had told herself for so long that she would raise her child alone, that love had no place in a life built from survival, that hearts like hers didn't get rescued, they only endured. But here was this man, broken in his own way, grieving, complicated, rich in money but aching in soul, looking at her like she was the one thing he hadn't known he needed. And in that moment, beneath the porch light, with the air cool around them and their babies dreaming just inside, they weren't just a millionaire and a single mother, weren't just a man with a past and a woman with scars. They were two people, two hearts, two lives that had weathered storms and still found the courage to sit side by side, not demanding love, but discovering that maybe, just maybe, they could still be worthy of it. After that night on the porch swing, with their hands still warm from the gentle intertwining of fingers, and their hearts marked silently by the rawness they'd shared, something shifted between Rena and Mr. Deacock, not in a sudden or dramatic way, but in the soft unfolding of something that had been quietly blooming for weeks beneath the surface of every shared silence and every careful word. The next morning felt different, not because of anything they said, but because of the way their eyes lingered just a little longer when they greeted each other, the way their bodies leaned ever so slightly closer when they sat side by side, no longer guarded, no longer unsure. And in the days that followed, that gentle current between them began to weave itself into the fabric of their daily lives. Mr. Deacock started appearing more often, not just at the park or at her doorstep, but inside her world in small, thoughtful ways that weren't grand but deeply felt, like when he brought groceries one morning and had somehow remembered her favorite kind of tea without ever being told, or when he bought new storybooks for Alex and her baby girl, leaving them wrapped with handwritten notes signed only with a simple smiley face, or when he arrived with 2 cups of warm coffee, one held out silently with just the kind of cream she liked, as if he had memorized the way she breathed and made it his routine to ease it. Rena, too, had begun to let her guard down in quiet ways, texting him after her baby had fallen asleep to ask how his day was, or sending him photos of Alex and her daughter playing together with captions like, "Your boy is a natural big brother," or sometimes just a simple, "Thank you for today," sent with a heart she never used before him. These exchanges became lifelines, not in desperate ways, but in ways that made both of them feel gently tethered to something real, something safe, and the laughter that used to be rare between them became more frequent, more full, like sun slipping through clouds. And they began sitting closer on the couch when the children napped, their shoulders brushing now and then without apology, and they shared things they didn't even know they'd needed to share, like childhood dreams that had faded, fears that still whispered in the dark, songs that made them cry for reasons they couldn't explain. And each revelation, no matter how small, felt like a brick removed from the emotional walls they'd spent years building. Rena had long believed that hope was a luxury for women who hadn't been abandoned, women who hadn't cried themselves to sleep while holding a baby in one arm and a job application in the other. But now, sitting beside this man who had once been only a shadow in the park and was now the first person who looked at her like she wasn't just surviving but deserving of softness, she found herself smiling at nothing sometimes, humming while cooking, brushing her hair with more care, and catching her reflection in the mirror with a spark in her eye that hadn't been there in years. One soft evening, while the golden haze of dusk wrapped the house in its tender light, and the children sat on the carpet with crayons and coloring books scattered like little dreams across the floor, Rena knelt beside Alex to help him find the right shade of blue for his drawing, and her fingers reached for the crayon at the same moment his did, and their hands touched. Not briefly, not awkwardly, but in a still pause that made both their hearts stutter, and she looked up, meeting his eyes in that quiet moment, and neither of them pulled away. Instead, Mr. Decock slowly reached out, his hand trembling only slightly, and brushed a loose curl away from her cheek, tucking it gently behind her ear with a touch so soft it felt like a question. And when she didn't flinch, didn't retreat, he let his hand linger for half a breath, his voice low and raw as he whispered, "You make this house feel like home." Rena's eyes shimmered at his words, not because they surprised her, but because they confirmed something she had only dared to believe in her dreams, something she had whispered to herself in her most vulnerable moments when she thought no one could ever see her. Not truly. And yet here he was, seeing her in ways that weren't about appearances or sympathy, but about the woman she had become after all the storms. She didn't speak, just smiled, a smile that held gratitude, fear, wonder, and something deeper that didn't need naming yet. And in that room, with coloring pages forgotten and a baby giggling softly in the background, the air grew thick with unspoken emotion, the kind that doesn't rush but settles slowly into the chest, like warmth after a long winter. That night, as she tucked her daughter into her crib and watched Alex fall asleep with a small plush tucked beneath his chin, Rena stood in the doorway and glanced back at Mr. Decock, who stood just a few feet behind her with his hands in his pockets and something vulnerable in his eyes. And in that silence, something unbreakable passed between them, not a confession, not a promise, but an understanding that they were no longer standing at the edge of something fragile, but stepping slowly into something strong. And for the first time in years, Rena let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, love wasn't something that happened to other people anymore, but something blooming quietly, steadily, inside her own heart. That evening ended with a silence that wasn't heavy. It was filled with something warm and unspoken, something that made Rena's chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in years. And as Mr. Decock gently helped her fold the blanket over Maya's sleeping figure and carefully lifted Liam in his arms to settle him onto the other end of the couch, the hush of the living room was laced with the quiet rhythm of shared breath and lingering glances, as though their laughter from earlier had opened a door neither of them had realized they were building together all this time. The TV screen glowed softly in the dim lighting, flickering gentle shadows across Rena's face as she turned to collect her phone from the armrest, whispering a thank you for the night, even though the words felt like a goodbye she suddenly didn't want to say. And as she stepped toward the hallway, intending to slip quietly into the cool night air and walk home wrapped in the calm of what they'd just shared, Mr. Decock's voice floated through the silence with a softness that stopped her mid-step. Not commanding, not pleading, just there like a truth that had been waiting too long to be spoken. "Don't go," he said, his tone not desperate but deeply honest, a thread of vulnerability winding through every syllable as his hand reached out instinctively and his fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and her breath caught. Not because she was afraid, but because it had been so long since someone had wanted her to stay, not out of pity or duty, but because her presence mattered. And as she turned to look at him, the sincerity in his eyes rooted her feet to the floor like something sacred. He stood just inches from her, his usually composed demeanor softened by something fragile in his gaze, something that trembled with uncertainty, but glowed with hope, and his thumb brushed the edge of her knuckles so slowly it made her heart ache, aching not from pain but from the fear of wanting, from the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could reach for something more than survival. And she didn't speak because there were no words big enough to explain the chaos in her chest. But her silence wasn't retreat. It was an invitation. And he took one step closer, his free hand lifting as though guided not by decision, but by instinct, his fingertips hovering for a second before tracing along her jaw in a touch so gentle it made her eyes sting with the intensity of it. And he didn't rush, didn't press, didn't assume. He just looked at her as if she was the only sound in the room, as if the rhythm of her breath was the only music he needed, and she felt herself leaning in without meaning to, drawn not by force but by the gravity of being seen, truly seen. And his eyes asked a question he didn't voice, but she understood it anyway, and instead of answering aloud, she closed the space between them, barely, her forehead brushing his, and then, like a breath exhaled too slowly, their lips met, not in fire, not in urgency, but in something quieter, something deeper, like two broken halves finding a seam where they could begin again. The kiss wasn't practiced or perfect, but it was honest, trembling with every emotion they hadn't dared name. Years of loneliness, fear, guarded affection, and unspoken admiration, all condensed into one still moment of connection. And it was slow, deliberate, as if each second was a promise that they weren't alone anymore, and his hand slid to the small of her back, not pulling, just resting there like an anchor, grounding her in the reality that someone wanted to hold her gently and mean it. And her hands, hesitant at first, found the edge of his shirt, fingers curling slightly, not pulling him in but keeping him from disappearing, and the kiss deepened just enough to make them both feel it, in their chest, in their breath, in the pulse that raced through their bodies like a confession neither of them had ever expected to speak aloud. When they finally pulled apart, it wasn't dramatic or rushed. They lingered for a beat, foreheads still touching, breaths mingling in the shared air between them, and neither moved, neither spoke, because everything that needed to be said was written in the way their bodies leaned into each other, in the way their fingers remained entwined like roots, taking hold in new soil, and finally, with a voice so quiet it almost dissolved into the moment, Rena whispered, "What are we doing?" Not as a rejection, not even out of fear, but because the weight of what had just passed between them demanded acknowledgement. And Mr. Decock smiled, not with his mouth but with his eyes, the kind of smile that carried truth in its stillness. And he answered not with explanation but with conviction. "Something we both need." And those 6 words didn't solve everything, but they unraveled a knot she hadn't known was strangling her spirit, because for the first time in so long, it wasn't about who she'd been forced to become. It was about who she might get to be, here, now, with someone who didn't flinch at her pain or pity her silence, but instead met her where she stood, hand in hand, breath in breath, kiss in kiss. They stood like that for what felt like both a second and a lifetime, and when Rena finally stepped back, it wasn't to run. It was to breathe, to let the world tilt slightly under her feet as she adjusted to the new shape of it. And Mr. Decock didn't chase her or let her go completely. He just watched her with a reverence that made her feel cherished, as though her every step was a verse in a poem he'd waited years to read. And she glanced back once, the edges of her lips curving into the faintest smile, not bold but real, and that small look lingered between them like the kiss, still clinging to their lips. And as she slipped out the door and into the soft night air, she felt the cool breeze press against her cheeks, but it couldn't touch the warmth blooming in her chest, the warmth of being kissed not for fun or fantasy, but for the first time in a way that said, "I see you." And she walked home slowly, each step an echo of everything unspoken, her heart no longer quiet but alive with the knowledge that something inside her had shifted, something gentle but irrevocable. And back inside, Mr. Decock sat on the edge of the couch beside his sleeping niece and nephew, his gaze unfocused but full, fingertips still tingling from the weight of her skin against his thoughts circling the feeling of her lips, her breath, her presence. And he smiled to himself, a smile born not of triumph, but of wonder, because he hadn't planned tonight, hadn't schemed for closeness, but he had opened his door to her sadness, her strength, her softness, and she had kissed him not with desperation, but with the same bravery she'd used to survive everything life had thrown at her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, both of them fell asleep in different houses, but dreamed in the same direction. Morning light filtered through Rena's bedroom window like a quiet reminder that even the most intimate moments of peace must eventually face the world outside, and as she opened her eyes to the stillness of her small but warm room, her thoughts immediately went to the kiss, the softness of his breath, the gentleness of his touch, the words he'd whispered like a promise not just to her, but to a version of her that she thought had died long ago. Yet that quiet joy was quickly overtaken by something colder, something louder, as her phone lit up beside her with notifications that refused to stop. Headlines blaring her name alongside his in bold letters, twisting what had been private into something cheap and exposed. Billionaire CEO caught with mystery. Single mom. Is this the woman who stole Decock's heart? And the images made her chest tighten, photos of them outside the apartment building, ones she hadn't even known were taken. Catching fleeting glances, his hand on her back, the soft tension of unspoken feelings between them suddenly distorted by camera angles and lurid captions. And as she scrolled through message after message, the knot in her stomach grew tighter. Some were cruel, accusations that she was using her daughter to manipulate a wealthy man, others invasive, strangers asking personal questions, demanding answers as if her heart were public property now, and even those meant to be kind only reminded her that she was now someone talked about, judged, dissected. The real ache, though, came when she left the house that day to walk Maya to school. Neighbors she used to smile at suddenly averted their eyes, and whispers followed her steps like a shadow, and even the cashier at the grocery store, who once chatted about recipes, now greeted her with stiff politeness and avoided eye contact, like love had made her a stranger. Rena tried to shake it off, tried to stay grounded in the memory of Mr. Decock's hand in hers, but by the time she returned home and found another tabloid stuffed into her mailbox, with Maya's innocent face blurred in the corner of a photograph, something in her cracked. Not anger, not outrage, just a deep, soul-level exhaustion, like the walls she'd spent years building to protect herself had been knocked down by cameras and gossip. And in that quiet heartbreak she made a decision, not because she didn't care about him, but because she did. And because the idea of Maya growing up with cameras pointed at her felt like a betrayal of the very peace Rena had fought for all these years. She walked into the bedroom and pulled out the worn suitcase she hadn't touched in years, the same one she'd used when she left Maya's father. And as she unzipped it with trembling hands and began placing clothes inside, shirts, pajamas, socks folded with distracted care, the silence in the room was broken only by the quiet rhythm of grief hiding beneath determination. And when she reached for Maya's favorite bedtime book, she paused, her fingers gripping its spine like an anchor, her chest aching with the weight of what she was about to leave behind. Not just the comfort of her home, but the growing possibility of a life with someone who made her feel cherished instead of tolerated. She was halfway through zipping the suitcase when the door opened behind her. Not loudly, not suddenly, but with purpose, and she didn't have to turn to know it was him, because the moment he stepped into the room, the atmosphere changed, like gravity had shifted, and when she finally looked up, her eyes filled with tears that had been waiting all morning to fall. And Mr. Deacock stood there, still dressed in the suit he'd worn to work, his face pale with concern and disbelief as he took in the sight of her packing, of her hands trembling over fabric, of the raw panic barely hidden behind her lowered lashes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the air between them too thick with unspoken things. But then he crossed the room in 3 strides, fast but careful, and knelt before her without hesitation, like a man kneeling not in desperation but in truth, and he took her hands into his with a steadiness that both grounded her and broke her. And his voice, when he finally spoke, wasn't loud. It was quiet, nearly hoarse, but packed with everything he felt. "I don't care what the world thinks. I care about you," he said. And those words hit her harder than any headline or whisper ever could, because in that moment they weren't just words. They were a stand, a stake in the ground for her, and for Maya, and for everything they could become. Her lips trembled as she tried to respond, but he shook his head gently, as if asking her to just listen, to just feel what he meant. And he leaned closer, pressing her hands to his chest, to the steady rhythm of his heart, as he continued, "If I lose you, I lose the only peace I've known since she died." And the vulnerability in his voice cracked something open in her, because he hadn't mentioned his late wife in so long, not out of avoidance, but out of deep respect. And to hear him connect peace with her, with Rena, felt like a sacred offering, one she didn't feel worthy of and yet couldn't reject. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the powerful CEO with the world watching him, but a man who had found solace in her presence, who had opened his home not just to her daughter, but to her chaos, her fears, her guarded tenderness. And when he pulled her into his arms, it wasn't possessive. It was protective, reverent, the kind of embrace that said, "I choose you, not in spite of the noise outside, but because of the silence you bring me inside." And her body folded into his like it had always been meant to fit there. And the sobs that finally escaped her chest weren't weak. They were cleansing, raw bursts of truth that melted against his shoulder as he held her tighter, whispering soft reassurances between each breath. "Let them talk," he murmured, again and again, until the words became a rhythm against her skin, a lullaby for the woman inside her who had been told too many times that love was something earned, bargained for, hidden away. And now it was being offered freely, publicly, defiantly. Rena buried her face into his neck, inhaling the scent of him, familiar, safe, anchoring, and whispered a broken, "I was scared," to which he replied, "So am I, but I want to be scared with you." And that admission, so simple, so unpolished, made her believe him more than any speech ever could, because real love wasn't fearless. It was choosing each other despite the fear. And when he pulled away just enough to look into her eyes, his thumbs gently wiping her tears, he added, "They don't get to write our story. We do." And she nodded, not because all the pain had disappeared, but because suddenly it had purpose, it had meaning, and it had them, something worth fighting for. Slowly, she pushed the suitcase aside, not unpacking it yet, but leaving it unzipped as a symbol of choice, of possibility, of love that was still fragile but no longer hidden. And as they sat on the floor together, tangled in each other's presence, neither speaking, neither needing to, the noise of the world outside remained. But in that room, in that moment, there was peace again, found not in silence but in being known and still chosen. The morning after the world had tried to tear them apart but failed, the sun rose with a gentleness that mirrored the peace Rena now felt blooming in her chest, and though the whispers outside hadn't vanished, they had lost their sting because she had chosen love, not the romantic ideal she once dreamed of, but the raw, imperfect, healing kind that held her when she shook and whispered truth, when fear screamed louder. She moved through the day with new grace, noticing how her steps were lighter, How even her daughter's giggles seemed to carry a brightness that felt like hope, reaching into every corner of their life. And while Maya played with her blocks and the late afternoon sun painted golden stripes across the living room floor, Rena's phone lit up with a message from Mr. Deacock, short and mysterious. "Be ready at 5. Dress comfortable. Bring Maya. Trust me." And though her first instinct fluttered with nerves, she smiled and tucked the phone to her heart, whispering softly to Maya, "We're going somewhere special," then helped her dress in her favorite yellow dress, the one with sunflowers that always made her spin in front of the mirror, giggling like sunshine wrapped in lace. Rena chose a simple soft blue maxi dress, the kind that flowed with the wind and made her feel light, alive, and as she tied her curls back and slid on sandals, her reflection caught her off guard. Not because she looked different, but because she saw peace in her eyes, a softness she hadn't seen since long before Maya was born, and it wasn't because of makeup or clothes. It was because she felt seen, chosen, cherished in a way no rumor could ever erase. When the car arrived and the driver smiled kindly, holding the door open with a simple, "He's waiting," she felt her heart thump with a curious blend of excitement and calm, as if her soul already knew this moment was going to reshape her life. They drove in near silence, Maya humming softly beside her, watching the world blur past the window, and Rena found her fingers tracing the seatbelt nervously as the car turned down a familiar road, the one leading to the park where so much had once changed, the place where she first cradled Alex in her arms, when his pain had called something maternal and fierce to life inside her. And as they pulled up near the gate, Rena gasped quietly, because what lay before her wasn't just a park. It had been transformed into something out of a dream, woven in love and careful thought. The grass had been lined with red and white roses in perfect swirls, petals gently brushing against the breeze as if dancing in quiet celebration, and fairy lights were draped through the trees, above like stars had come down to witness something sacred. And it wasn't loud or extravagant. It was intimate, magical, a world built just for her, and she stepped out slowly, lifting Maya into her arms, feeling her daughter's arms loop around her neck as both their eyes widened at the sight. A path had been traced in petals leading into the heart of the park, and at the end of that path stood Alex, dressed in a tiny navy blue blazer, his curls neatly combed, his eyes wide with pride and joy, holding something in his little hand, a small, velvet box, clutched like it carried treasure, and as soon as he saw them, he broke into a sprint, the kind of pure, unfiltered run that only a child could master. Laughter echoing from his chest as he reached Rena and threw his arms around her waist before stepping back and holding up the box with both hands, as if it weighed more than it did because of what it meant. And with a smile so bright it made her eyes sting, he asked in his small, sweet voice, "Will you be my mommy forever?" And Rena's breath hitched, her knees nearly giving way beneath her as tears pooled in her lashes, because the question carried more than childlike wonder. It carried a longing, a choice, a desire to belong wrapped in innocence. And as she bent down to Alex's level, cupping his face with shaking hands, she saw movement behind him. And there, emerging slowly but surely from behind the roses, was Mr. Deacock, his expression unreadable at first, but as he drew closer, the emotion in his eyes became undeniable. This wasn't about spectacle or grand gestures, it was about surrendering pride and opening his heart fully, and he knelt beside his son with a steadiness that contrasted the storm in his gaze, lifting his hand to place gently over Alex's, steadying the box they both held out to her. And when he spoke, his voice trembled, not with nerves, but with the gravity of what he was about to offer. "Rena, I didn't just fall in love with you," he said slowly, deliberately, as if each word carried the weight of a vow. "I found home with you." And the honesty in that sentence shattered the last bit of fear she had hidden in her chest, because he wasn't just asking her to be part of his life. He was asking to build a new one together, one rooted in trust, in laughter, in parenting and partnership and vulnerability. And Rena's lips parted, a gasp escaping as tears began to fall freely, not from sadness or even joy, but from the overwhelming sense that every heartbreak, every rejection, every lonely night had led to this moment, to this clearing among roses, to this man on one knee not asking for her to change, but inviting her to stay as she was and be loved fully, deeply, endlessly. Her hands shook as she reached out, not for the box, but for them, for Alex's little fingers and Mr. Decock's larger, calloused ones, and she held them both like a promise, like an answer, like a silent yes already forming on her tongue, before it reached her lips in a whisper that sounded like the wind had been waiting to carry it. Yes, she said. And the word echoed not because she shouted it, but because the park seemed to hold its breath and release it with joy, as if the earth itself had been waiting for this joining. And laughter spilled out of Alex first, as he jumped into her arms, hugging her tight, and Mr. Decock rose to wrap his arms around both of them, one strong arm encircling Rena's waist, the other resting over Maya's shoulder as she giggled from her perch in Rena's embrace. And for the first time they stood not as fractured pieces of separate lives, but as one whole, a new family born not of blood, but of choice and love and healing. And as the fairy lights blinked softly above them and petals scattered with the breeze like blessings whispered on the air, Rena rested her forehead against his, whispering a tearful, "Thank you." And he replied, "No, thank you for showing me how to live again." And they kissed then, not like their first kiss, which had been cautious and questioning, but like a seal, a vow, lips meeting with certainty, with shared breath and futures stitched together beneath the trees where it all began. And as Maya clapped and Alex squealed, she said yes, into the air like a victory. Rena realized something deeper than all her emotions. This wasn't just a proposal, it was a healing promise, not only from him to her, but from the universe to her soul, whispering, "You are safe now. You are home." They stood in that quiet park, surrounded by scattered petals and twinkling fairy lights, holding each other in an embrace that spoke of beginnings instead of endings. And as the sun finally dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, the world around them softened. No noise, no judgment, no shadows, just a calm stillness that wrapped around their small family like a prayer answered at last. In the days that followed, preparations began, not for a spectacle, but for something sacred, intimate and personal, because neither Rena nor Mr. Decock craved grand headlines or public attention. They had already been the center of too many storms, and now all they wanted was a quiet corner of the world where their love could grow uninterrupted. And so they chose a private garden nestled behind the very mansion that once felt too large, too cold, too empty, now alive with color and warmth and voices that echoed with belonging. The wedding was held beneath an arch woven with ivy and soft white roses, just enough guests to witness, but not enough to distract. And Rena walked down a simple stone path barefoot, her dress flowing like it had been stitched from morning light, Maya walking proudly beside her tossing petals, her curls bouncing with each step, while Alex stood at the end of the path with Mr. Decock, both of them in matching white suits, beaming like the world was finally right. And when their eyes met, Rena and Mr. Decock shared a look that needed no words, because this wasn't about starting over. It was about continuing a love that had already proven itself in silence and struggle and second chances. Their vows weren't long, but they were truthful. She promised to never let the past dim his light again, and he vowed to always carry her dreams with the same care he carried her heart. and as they kissed beneath the arch, and the soft breeze clapped its approval through the rustling leaves, Maya clapped too, shouting, "Yay, Mommy!" while Alex laughed and tugged at their joined hands, begging them to dance, and dance they did. Barefoot on the grass, with no music, but laughter and wind and the soft thump of three hearts becoming one rhythm. When they returned to the mansion that night, the home didn't feel like stone and walls and chandeliers. It felt like breath and warmth and story, with toys strewn across velvet rugs and juice cups on the marble countertops, and the sound of cartoon voices floating from the living room. And Rena loved every inch of it, even the chaos, because now every part of the house was alive with memory in the making, with bedtime stories under thick quilts, and burnt toast on rushed mornings, and sweet, sleepy kisses traded between corners of responsibilities and stolen seconds of affection. And even Mr. Decock, who once lived like a shadow behind suits and silence, now walked barefoot down the hallway, a child balanced on one arm and a stuffed bear tucked under the other, his laugh echoing from the staircase as he learned how to tickle without mercy and how to make pancakes shaped like animals, even if they rarely looked like the right ones. Rena, empowered by the life she had risen from, opened a support center in the heart of the city, a space for single mothers like her, where pain was acknowledged and strength was rebuilt. And every time she looked into the eyes of a woman walking in for the first time with her child and fear clinging to her shoulders, she saw her old self and whispered the same words that saved her. "You're not alone anymore." And that center became a light to many, a home within the city where survival turned to hope and hope turned into power. At the same time, Mr. Decock, once the man who buried his grief beneath board meetings and billion-dollar transactions, now made space for laughter and softness, walking away from deals that didn't align with his heart and choosing family first without apology. And every time Rena caught him crouched beside Maya, patiently brushing a doll's hair or letting Alex clamber onto his shoulders in the middle of a phone call, her heart bloomed all over again, with the truth that this man was no longer a stranger to joy. He had become fluent in it. The days turned into months filled with weekend picnics and backyard movie nights, with scraped knees and bubble baths and spontaneous dance parties in the kitchen. And it wasn't perfect. Nothing worth keeping ever is. But it was real, and it was theirs. And that made it beautiful beyond measure. When Alex first called her mom, it wasn't in a dramatic moment. It was during a regular breakfast, toast crumbs on his chin, and he said it like it had always belonged to her. And Rena had to turn away for a moment just to let her tears fall freely without making him worry. And when Maya, during a bedtime cuddle, looked up at Mr. Decock and said, "Good night, Daddy," he didn't respond with words. He simply held her tighter, closed his eyes, and let the love wash over him like a tide he no longer needed to resist. Every evening, when the world quieted, the children asleep, dishes drying, the air cool and gentle, Rena and Mr. Decock took slow walks through the garden, hand in hand, their steps unhurried, their silences full, often pausing beneath the tree where they first kissed to trace how far they'd come. Not in distance, but in healing, and on one such night, stars spilled across the sky like the universe had opened just for them, and they stopped beside the roses that still bloomed even out of season, leaning into each other like the roots of a tree leaning into earth. And Rena looked up at the sky and whispered, "I never thought life could look like this," to which Mr. Decock, with eyes soft and voice barely more than a breath, replied as he wrapped his arms around her from behind, "That's because no one ever showed us that love doesn't have to hurt. It just has to be chosen every day." And he tilted her chin gently, gazing into her with a depth only two people who had survived could understand, and added, "You were never just a chapter. You were the whole story. And in that one sentence, everything they had fought for, cried through, dared to build, stood complete. Not perfect, not finished, but whole. And as they stood there under the stars, surrounded by the laughter of children echoing faintly through open windows and the scent of roses trailing on the breeze, they knew that the life they had now wasn't a miracle. It was a home built by love, one brick at a time, with hands that had once only known how to shield, now learning how to hold and protect and cherish forever.